The Pilgrims. We hear about them. We see old-time pictures of them around Thanksgiving wearing funny hats. Their boots are tall and their belt-buckle game is on point. But who were these people? And what was the deal with the Mayflower? Was it a ship they built? Or did they just rent it at a boat office somewhere in England? Their journey was long and treacherous, and their arrival to the New World had both a good nature and a dark side that would fill history books with stories of settlers, natives, and tales of the first Thanksgiving. But as with any story, the truth is often a complicated and nuanced narrative of events, but nonetheless, a story worth telling. Although we casually refer to the group of settlers who set sail on the Mayflower and arrived in Massachusetts in 1620 as Pilgrims, the term is a relatively new one. While the term was used by William Bradford to describe his journey on the Mayflower, there is no record of the group bearing that label until over 150 years later. The first documented use of the term that was not simply quoting Bradford was at a December 22, 1798 celebration of Forefathers' Day in Boston. A song composed for the occasion used the word pilgrims, and the participants drank a toast to the Pilgrims of Leyden. The term was used predominantly during Plymouth's next Forefathers' Day celebration in 1800 and has been used since then to describe the group. The Pilgrims were a religious group from England, known as the Brownists or Separatists, founded by Robert Brown in 1581. Brown became the leader in a group that wanted to separate from the Church of England. Brown eventually rejoined the English Church, becoming a priest. His early separatist ideology that true Christian churches were voluntary and separate congregations, not whole Christian nations, was revered amongst the remaining dissenters. The separatist movement was controversial. Under the Act of Uniformity in 1559, it was illegal not to attend the official Church of England services, with a fine of 1 shilling for each Sunday and holy day missed. The penalties included imprisonment and larger fines for conducting unofficial services. The Seditious Sectaries Act of 1592 was specifically aimed at outlawing the Brownists. Under this policy, the London Underground Church members were repeatedly imprisoned. Eventually, the group left to live in the Netherlands, where the laws were more tolerant of their religious perspectives. Although they did have more freedom, they were outsiders. Their children began to be more Dutch than English, and the separatists felt as though their way of life would fade away if they remained in the Netherlands. After much deliberation and thoughtful prayer, they elected to embark on a long journey to a land across the Atlantic Ocean. Two leaders in the Mayflower voyage, Robert Cushman and John Carver, were sent to England to solicit a land patent. The charter was granted under one condition from the king, that the Leyden group's religion would not receive official recognition. The parties all agreed, and the separatists devised a plan to get them all to the New World. The original course of action was to have 2 ships and to depart from Southampton. However, the Speedwell had complications. It sprung a leak, and the travelers only made it as far as Plymouth in southwest England. William Bradford was determined to make the crossing on the remaining ship, a rented vessel called the Mayflower. Of the 120 original passengers, 102 were chosen to make the journey on the single ship. The group set sail later in the year during September, a time when storms and uncertainty were awaiting the voyagers. The Pilgrims weren't the only travelers on board. About half were Puritans or explorers in search of adventure. Tolerance was critical, not only on board the tiny vessel, but also in order to successfully form a new colony once they arrived. The need to work together was tested early. The poor diet of over-salted foods, lack of vitamin C, and lack of activity or movement contribute both to fatigue and sickness. To make matters worse, during a storm, the main beam of the ship bowed and cracked, falling over and causing water to flood into the deck. The situation was precarious, and even the experienced sailors were concerned. Fortunately, the passengers had a large screw, most likely used for constructing houses, which was used to prop the beam back into place and avoid further damage. The conditions were so bad that the crew was forced to lower the sails and allow the currents of wind and water to take them where it may. There was talk of turning back, but the decision was made to continue, and so they sailed on towards the Hudson in northern Virginia, or what is now modern-day New York. They were late arriving and knew they were off course, but how far was unknown. Their supplies were nearly gone, and the passengers were sick and emaciated. While on the trip, a child was born. Fittingly, he was given the name Oceanus. At long last, after 65 days at sea, land was spotted on November 9th, 1620. Judging by the coastline, the captain was able to confirm that they were at Cape Cod, a shoreline well known to English fishermen. They then turned south in an attempt to sail towards their original destination of the Hudson Valley. However, the ship was again met with storms and was too dangerous to travel for fear of catastrophe, so they turned back, lowering anchor at Provincetown. There was disagreement as to what to do next. The patent they purchased from England allowed them to be in the Hudson Valley. Since they were nowhere near there, some wanted to return to England, while others wanted to stay. And if they did stay, what rules would they follow, since the Virginia colony was miles away? In order to continue, a compromise must be met. So the leaders of the group sat down and drew up one of the most significant contracts in the history of the continent. Since the passengers were not all Pilgrims or Separatists, they made up a variety of belief systems. They were Puritans, as well as people that were there more for adventure than to avoid religious persecution. In order to live in harmony, the group of travelers needed to find a compromise. That compromise was the Mayflower Compact, and it became what many believe to be an early form of modern democracy. At the time, there was very little room for tolerance amongst beliefs or cultures other than your own. And although by modern standards, the reach of that harmony fell very short, the sentiment was the beginning of a society made up of differing opinions, held together by an understanding of necessary peace. The document was signed by 41 men aboard the Mayflower and drew upon the common bonds that held them together: God in heaven and King James on earth. The text reads, "Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance by the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws." Issues would be decided by voting, the key ingredient of democracy. It was ratified by majority rule, with 41 adult male pilgrims signing for the 102 passengers, 74 males and 28 females. Included in the company were 13 male servants and 3 female servants, along with some sailors and craftsmen hired for short-term service to the colony. John Carver was chosen as the colony's first governor. It was Carver who had chartered the Mayflower, and his is the first signature on the Mayflower Compact, being the most respected and affluent member of the group. The Mayflower Compact is considered to be one of the seeds of American democracy, and historians have called it the world's first written constitution. Now that an agreement was reached among the passengers, the greatest challenge lay ahead: living amongst the harsh climate of the Massachusetts winter alongside a native people that they scarcely understood but so desperately needed their help. On November 15, 1620, William Bradford and a small crew left the Mayflower to explore the land. Because of the shallow water, the Mayflower had to anchor far from the coast, so the smaller boat embarked through freezing waters to the shore. When they arrived, it was eerily quiet. The travelers were terrified of the natives. They had heard stories of past interactions and were led to believe the worst. The men found a mound with caches of corn they had never seen. They took some for themselves with the intent of replacing it at some point. Had they not taken it, however, their chances of survival would have been slim at best. While exploring the coastline, they were attacked by the natives. Arrows landed around them, and the settlers retaliated with their guns and managed to chase them away. There were no casualties during this altercation. The silence of the land was broken, and now the newcomers realized they weren't welcome on this side of Cape Cod. Many of them were ill, coughing incessantly, and taken with fever. Some were suffering from scurvy due to the lack of vitamin C. They desperately needed to find a permanent settlement, so they set sail to the other side of the bay, landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts, a familiar name which bore a bit of irony. The settlers had embarked on their mission from Plymouth, England. The settlers felt that perhaps the familiar name meant it was a sign to land there. But landing in Plymouth was not the end of their struggle. It was still winter, and when they landed on the coast, the land was desolate and there were human remains scattered across the beaches. The travelers had no way of knowing what happened to the people who died there. They were exhausted, ill, out of supplies, and death surrounded them. To make matters worse, when William Bradford returned to the Mayflower from exploring the coast, he found that his wife Dorothy had fallen overboard and died. Survival seemed unlikely, and hope seemed to be fading away. Through their faith and prayer, William Bradford and the others persevered, and on December 21st, 1620, the first group of settlers landed on the frozen shore. The price they paid was heavy. About half of the settlers did not survive the first winter. Food was scarce, the water was harsh, and they barely managed to build their first house amidst the cold, blustery anger of the winter season. As they hobbled through the unsympathetic conditions of the environment, they got the sense they were not alone. Someone was watching them. Long before the settlers arrived, the land which later became known as Plymouth was home to the Wampanoags. Prior to the English contact in the 17th century, the Wampanoag numbered as many as 40,000 people living across 67 villages composing the Wampanoag Nation. The Wampanoag lived on this land for over 12,000 years before the English arrived. The Wampanoag were organized into a confederation in which a leader, known as a sachem, presided over a number of other lesser sachems. The colonists often referred to him as king, and although the position was similar, a sachem was elected and bound to consult tribal elders. Before the arrival of the Pilgrims, from 1615 to 1619, an epidemic carried by rodents arriving in European ships dramatically reduced the population of the Wampanoag and neighboring tribes. Indigenous deaths from the epidemic facilitated the European invasion and colonization of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. To make matters worse, the neighboring tribes were concerned for the Wampanoags as well, since due to their reduced numbers, they were more vulnerable to an invasion. Although it was a risk, some of the Wampanoag saw the arrival of the Mayflower as a potential to form an alliance. The settlers were able to make camp and build their houses. Although food was scarce, spring was approaching and offered hope of sustenance. The greatest threat was a people they had never met. Would the natives of the land accept them and live in peace, or would they resort to violence and drive them out? The answer would come on March 16, 1621, when a man confidently approached the settlers, speaking to them in English. The tribes of the area had encountered the English before and were familiar with their customs. Samoset was his name, and he promised to return with the chief of the Wampanoags, Massasoit, and another translator in order to form an alliance. The natives in the area were weakened due to the dying European diseases, and cooperation with the English could benefit them in defense from other tribes. In exchange, the natives would provide the settlers with food and knowledge of the land and how to grow new crops such as corn. Massasoit, along with his translator Squanto, would enter a treaty with the settlers, one he would keep for the remainder of his life. This allowed the Pilgrims to build their settlement without fear from local people. It also benefited the tribe by offering a buffer between them and the neighboring clans. The natives also had access to English technology such as knives and axes made from steel. Only 47 settlers were left, and although the group was small, they were still diverse in terms of their belief. In a novel legal classification, one did not need to be a member of the church in order to have a vote. There were two circles of law, one for the congregation of the church and the other for non-members who were still regarded as political equals, providing democratic consensus. It is important to note that a day of Thanksgiving was common amongst the Calvinist Puritans and Separatists. The Church of England had many holidays, as did the Catholic Church. During the Protestant Reformation, and in particular the Calvinist philosophy that captured the Puritans and Separatists, holidays were pared down to only two non-specific events: a day of fasting or a day of Thanksgiving. A day of fasting would be a day or days of fasting and prayer during a time of plight or distress in order to contemplate God's purpose. a day or days of Thanksgiving, would be a celebration of the plenty of God's provision and would involve eating and fellowship as a congregation. With the harvest on the horizon and supplies on the plenty, a harvest festival and time of Thanksgiving was in order. The summer had yielded enough food to last the winter, and a celebration was going to take place. Massasoit and 90 of his men attended, bringing 5 deer as gifts. The event lasted 3 days and is often regarded as the first Thanksgiving. It is sometimes considered a great holiday of peace and tolerance, but that peace would die out with Massasoit and William Bradford. After the passing of the 2 respective leaders, more and more European settlers arrived. The treaty between the groups was forgotten, and the natives were attacked with disease and warfare. It would be the first of many treaties with the natives that were dishonored by the government. Massasoit's son was a casualty in one of these wars, and the natives would suffer much loss at the violation of this treaty and many others that followed. So much so that many natives regard the Thanksgiving holiday as a day of mourning. Although the events of the Separatists, later known as Pilgrims, did in fact happen, overcoming great adversity, forming a prerequisite for democracy, a feast celebrated with the natives, the day and the events are not without controversy. Nonetheless, the holiday is celebrated on the last Thursday in November in the United States, becoming an official holiday in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. Other nations have their own day as well. Canada, Australia, Brazil, and the UK all have their own Thanksgiving celebration. Although its origins have mixed perspective, it is important to remember what we do have and to be thankful for what we've been given.